So we're going to start with a game, if that's all right. We're going to play rock, paper, scissors. So hopefully everyone knows how this goes. You go 1, 2, 3. You do rock, which beats scissors, or you do scissors, which beats paper, or you do paper, which beats rock. You can't do fire, a la Joey and Friends. And the only way it's going to work is if you turn to the person next to you and just have a quick game. Is that all right? Does everyone know how it goes? Sure they do? Bedlam. Right, has everyone managed to play one game? Everyone managed to get a game in? What I didn't appreciate before, I think, was the sheer number of draws that you have, and so you have to just keep going until you finally get a result. So ideally as well, you'd play best of 3, but maybe if we've got time at the end, we can carry that on. But the reason I wanted to do that was because I'm quite interested in the decision making that went on, not just whether you chose rock, paper, or scissors, but just decision making in general. So why you chose the seat that you're sitting in, why you chose to even come today, or the clothes that you're wearing. But before I go into that, I am just going to talk about a plane crash. Take the rough with the smooth. I appreciate that this might be triggering for some people who really don't like flying, so I guess ideally you wouldn't be able to listen for the next 5 minutes. But what I can also say is that this plane crash happened years and years ago. It was in March 1977. And what happened was there was a terrorist incident on the island of Gran Canaria, which forced a load of planes to divert to Los Rodeos Airport in Tenerife. And this airport was ill-equipped to deal with the sheer number of planes and the size of them. And they only had rudimentary radio. They had no ground radar. So they could only see what was going on around the airport by looking out the control tower. And on that day, there were intermittent patches of fog drifting across the airport. So a very tired and stressed KLM crew who had been diverted made their way to the end of the runway in order to take off. So this is a kind of illustration of where they got to. This doesn't happen. You don't taxi up active runways. You go around the taxiway, but because there were so many planes parked, they had to do this. And so they made their way there and they were waiting for the control tower to give them permission to take off. A Pan Am crew in another Boeing 747, they were taxiing up the runway to take their position behind the KLM. But because of their unfamiliarity with the airport, because of the fog, they missed their turning. They were supposed to get off at exit 3, but they missed their turning. And so they were still on the runway. There was a load of garbled conversation on the radio later, and what happened was the control tower gave the KLM crew their instructions for when they were going to take off, so what they were going to do after they took off. And they interpreted that as permission to take off. So they released the brakes, put down the throttle, and away they went. The Pan Am crew could hear this conversation and started to get, a little bit concerned. And so they put the power on and tried to turn off the runway onto the grass verge as fast as they could. But they didn't do it in time. The KLM spotted the Pan Am out of the fog about 100 meters away from it. They were already going 160 miles an hour. There was no way they could go round it. There was no way they could stop. So they tried to go over. And so essentially you've got these Boeing 747s, which are obviously massive, and it's bunny hopping over another one, which it failed to do. So the nose missed the fuselage, but the engines of the KLM crashed through the Pan Am. And then the KLM stalled, crashed in a huge fireball further down the runway. In one of those sort of horrible little twerks that you get with these kinds of crashes, they actually refueled. So the KLM was just a huge fireball, and they actually crashed in a big patch of fog as well. So for when the emergency services came out, they didn't even realise there were 2 planes involved at first. They thought it was just the Pan Am, and they didn't really know what was going on. So 583 people died in this crash. It was the worst until 9/11 in terms of lives lost. It's the second worst still. It was really terrible. As I say, it wouldn't happen again. They learned quite a lot from each crash that happens. But for me, it's illustrative and instructive, I think. So how is it possible that two massive planes can crash on an active runway? You've got the situation, the context, the technology, but at the heart of it, you've got the decision-making of the crews and what they were doing at the time and what they were thinking. And it was one of the many disasters that I studied during my master's in 2007, 2008, where I did human factors. And we were quite interested, obviously, in the human side of things and looking at the whole situation, because quite often, especially with plane crashes, they end up blaming pilot error. And that's the way it goes down. They tend to take the decision out of the situation, the context, and then someone has to have blame. There has to be some culpability. So KLM ended up having to pay out a lot of money on behalf of the pilots and their error. But the argument was, and the argument that we got used to, was the idea that anyone in that situation would have made the same mistake. So if you put someone who had the same upbringing, the same genetics, the same education and training in that situation with the same stress, then they would have done exactly the same thing. Alongside this, I've also always been interested in this idea of fate, this idea that your life is predetermined by a supernatural power, which I never really liked, especially the bit about supernatural power, that your life is kind of dictated by something else. But then last year I read an article in The Guardian about free will. And at the heart of it was a guy called Sam Harris who wrote this book. And he was suggesting basically there's no such thing as free will. And through my masters and through this kind of thing, I thought this was quite interesting. So free will, of course, being the agency basically to make your own decisions and make your own choices. And he argues it doesn't exist. So in Stoicism, which I've shoehorned in, they argue that you should put things in two buckets, things you can control and things you can't control. But what if you can't control anything, like consciously? How would that make you feel? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out two reasons as to why there's no such thing as free will. So the first one is that neuroimaging quite clearly demonstrates that most decisions happen before they arrive in your consciousness. So you play rock, paper, scissors, but actually the decision to choose one of those over another one was made before it arrived in your consciousness. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like you were the active agent in that choice, but that's not actually what happened. In the 1960s, a guy called Benjamin Libet did a really interesting study where he put electrodes on people's head and he asked them to watch a timer and to note when they felt the urge to raise a finger. And what he found was that people felt that urge about a quarter of a second before they actually raised their finger. But by studying the brain waves, he was able to establish that actually the brain activity was happening over 300 milliseconds before they even felt the urge. So it was happening before they were aware of it. I've kind of cherry-picked a few studies, but more recently there's been studies that show recordings from the cortex where 256 neurons can predict with 80% accuracy a person's decision to move at 700 milliseconds before they become aware of it, which is quite a lot. And actually 256 neurons is a tiny amount. And that led Sam Harris to say this. In 2009, there was another study which adds a slightly different flavour to it, I think, which is, in this one, there was a cursor at the bottom of the screen in the middle, and there was a like and a dislike button in the top corners. And in the middle of the screen would flash a word like a race or religion or gender, and all you had to do was move the cursor to like or dislike. And what they found by studying the micro movements of the cursor, they found that actually people were moving towards one thing, often dislike, before it jutted away. Other cognitive processes took over and it jutted away to a different thing. And so people who had a lot of certainty about their attitudes towards different races and genders and religions found themselves quite surprised and appalled by what was lurking in their brain. It's a really good indication, actually, of unconscious bias. And it also gets at this idea that things are more complicated than the real me. So there's conflicts going on in your brain all the time underneath the level of your consciousness. And context, such as how tired you are, how stressed you are, drugs, alcohol, determines which part of the brain wins effectively and which part is kind of articulated. So for the KLM pilot, if they weren't as tired, perhaps they would have made a completely different decision. In 2006, I don't know if anyone remembers this, but Mel Gibson, such a weird thing to talk about at conference, Mel Gibson got pulled over for drink driving, and he tried to convince the police officer to let him drive home, of course, which they said no. And he started reeling off a load of anti-Semitic slurs. And what happened after that was obviously a big media storm. And people were saying, well, this is the real version of him because he was disinhibited, with the drinking. And this is what he really thinks. And he was saying, well, it's not what I really think. And actually, he'd spent the previous day with a very good friend of his who was Jewish. So, and it's interesting because what we tend to boil people down into buckets are either good people or bad people. Actually, it's a lot more complex than that. I've got other examples of how things move beneath the level of consciousness. So in sport, so again, I've shoehorned a bit of cricket in here. So if a bowler bowls a ball at 90 miles an hour and the batter is 22 yards away, they've got 0.48 seconds to see the ball, make a judgment on where it's going, to get into physical position and then to actually play a shot. There is no conscious thinking going on during that process. If there was, the ball would be past them, it would have hit them, or it would have hit the stumps long before they'd done anything. So they are thinking, but it's automatic thinking, it's not conscious thinking. Same with Formula One, if you watch that, they're driving at 200 miles an hour and they're often having conversations with their engineers. They're not talking about what they're going to have for tea or anything like that, but they're not talking at the same time about driving and hitting the apex and hitting the braking zones. And then they're playing as well with these really complex dashboards where they like tell them to change a setting, and they're like playing around with these things, all while driving. So like you and I wouldn't be able to do that. If we were going 200 miles an hour, we'd be thinking about, trying to keep the car on the road and where we're going to get a spare pair of underwear. That would be our primary thought. Beyond sport, so there's a lot of practice that goes into it and all this stuff, this automatic thinking going on. But beyond sport, there's other sort of life bits and pieces that I've kind of noticed. So one is that at work we've got a door code to get in. I could tell you what the door code is, I'm not going to, but I could tell you what the door code is, but I'd have to sit and work it out because the way I get in is by just following a pattern that my hand moves in. And then what happens is the third floor, there's the same code, but the pad looks slightly different and it's often completely perplexing. I also have a Brompton fold-up bike, and I've had it for 13 years, and I've folded it and unfolded it thousands of times. But if I get interrupted halfway through, I've got no idea what's going on. And I have to almost pretend that I'm starting from scratch in order to find where I was in the process. And another good example is walking. So a 1-year-old learning to walk will be spending a lot of energy and mental effort in order to do it, to learn how to do it. Their brains are growing, they're sleeping a lot more, maybe not always when you want them to, and they're eating a lot more, and they're going through this huge change, lots of learning in order to learn how to walk. But of course, when you get to adulthood, not even then, you've learned to walk, and you don't think about it anymore. We haven't got the brain power to think about things like that anymore. It's automated. And so if so much of your thinking is automatic and you're just running programs and decisions end up in your consciousness, then where's the free will in that? They might ask. That's, believe it or not, the first reason why there's no such thing as free will. The second is much shorter. So there's the idea that there's very little randomness in the world, and at least neurologically as well. There's the laws of nature and the laws of physics, and everything must follow the thing that went before it. And you can't just interfere. So if you imagine, in a very basic sense and not accurate, that all of the inputs, like taste, sight, sound, all come into the back of your head, your brain will start firing and neurons will start firing, passing information on. Imagine your consciousness is at the front. By the time it arrives there physically, it's too late for you to intervene in that process. It's already happened. And so if none of your thinking is originating in your consciousness, you're not in a position really to intervene in any of it anyway. It's just happening. And that led David Eagleman to say this, which I think is a really nice quote, because it doesn't feel like this. It feels very much like we're the captains of the ship. And not only are we the captains, but we know everything that's going on the ship, but actually it's not always that simple. And this does feel a little bit depressing. So on my first slide, it said this talk might ruin your life. It won't. But the reason I say that is because a lot of people have come out and said about there being no such thing as free will. People find it really depressing, this idea they've got no agency in their life. And they've received death threats and things like that. It's quite bad. Because actually, if you take it to its logical conclusion, I might argue that the KLM pilots had no culpability in that crash because they were at the end point of a series of decisions and anyone could have made that mistake. You could extend that logic to murderers, though, because you could suggest, well, they've got no culpability either because they're there at the end of a sequence of events of their upbringing, genetics, the situation, the context. And so while we should be keeping them away from society, if they haven't got agency over what they're doing, should we even be punishing them? And then the really depressing bit is that all your achievements, how much do they mean if you haven't got agency over your own life? And I've made a bit of a skeleton argument, and I don't think you should be depressed. It's a bit like, I don't know if you've seen DIY SOS with Nick Knowles, but it always turns out well in the end. So the arguments that I think I've made so far should support this idea of mental models, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So this idea that mental models can shape your behaviour, they set approach to problem solving, to doing tasks. And we all have mental models. We bring them to everything that we do, even when it's novel things. So if you apply for a passport, you might go online, you'll fill an application form, do some ID checks, you'll send off, and then a few weeks later you'll get a passport, if you're lucky. If you're then applying for a credit card and you've never done that before, you might think it's the same. So you go online, do an application form, do some ID checks, and then you'll get a credit card. But then there's this credit check process that comes in, it kind of upsets your flow a little bit. And so you adapt your mental model and you change it for the next thing that you do. They affect everything, like every interaction, and they're all automatic and learned. And the internet's burnt loads of our mental models into our brains. And we do research on our products and services to understand people's mental models and to try and match them up. Because it's a problem if users' mental models don't match the system that we're designing. But they're also really difficult for people to describe. You don't have a great insight into your own mental models. And so it's really difficult for people to articulate exactly what they are. So that's why we do observation. So I think this whole argument about having no free will and then about mental models, I think has two really interesting applications. So the first is research. So we do research in lots of different ways. We do observational research, attitudinal research. But even when we're doing observational research, we still ask why people did things. So they'll do something and you'll say, oh, why did you do that? And then they'll tell us. And I guess I'm asking whether there's much of a point in that, given that they don't necessarily have any insight into why they did anything, because it was all automatic. So what you'll get is someone's story, a narrative about why they did something, but you won't necessarily understand what was really going on there. And also you have to bear in mind which version of them you're getting. Are they tired? Are they stressed? Are they hungry? And I think good researchers take all this stuff into account, have a really good idea of it. So usability testing, things like that, should be about observation, and I think taking subsequent explanations with a pinch of salt. And then interviews should be about, you're going to be hearing people's explanations, but it should be about grounding that in past behaviour. So you want to speak to people who have done something recently or are doing it currently, rather than getting them pontificating about something they're about to do or did several years ago. Because all you're hearing then are their stories about things. And you would have seen this disparity, by the way, between narrative and observed behaviour if you ever watch any usability testing. And they're doing a task and it's supposed to take about 30 seconds. And it's taken 15 minutes, and everyone observing is crying. You know, someone's getting fired as a result of this. The designer's pulling their hair out, and it's just gone wrong at every turn. And then the facilitator asks the participant how they thought it went, and they're like, yeah, it went all right. And you're like, what? So I think that research should be about analytics, observation, objective, quantifiable data as much as possible, and knowing what you're doing when you're asking for attitudinal things. It's not always going to be helpful, which is one reason why asking which your favourite UI is on LinkedIn isn't a good idea. The second application, I think, is cognitive diversity. So if you assume that many decisions are automatic and you're applying mental models to everything you do, then you need lots of different mental models in any given problem space. Otherwise, you're going to have huge blind spots. So there's a really interesting study in 2006 by Phillips and her team. And what they did, it was a murder mystery. There was loads of complex material. There was alibis, witness statements, suspects. And they had two different types of teams. And then they had individuals trying to do these murder mysteries. So one type of team had 4 friends in it, so the homogenous team. And the other type of team had 3 friends and a complete stranger. And what they found was, results-wise, is the individuals got it right about 44% of the time. The homogenous teams, 54%. So you can see by starting to work with other people and collaborating, you're getting a better result. And then the teams with the stranger in, they got it right 75% of the time. So there's like a step change between collaborating and then collaborating with a stranger. And that's not even the most interesting thing about that study. The most interesting thing about that study was how they felt and how they reported feeling afterwards. So the homogenous groups very much felt like it was great. They had a great time. They were all mirroring each other, and they felt really comfortable. There was no debate. There was no disagreement. And actually, they were really confident that they got it right, even though they got it right 54% of the time. And then the other team with the strangers in, they were much less, they didn't enjoy the experience much at all. It was uncomfortable. There was lots of debate, lots of disagreement, and they were far less confident about their answers being right, which I think has a really interesting application, because if you ever find yourself in a complex problem-solving space and you're with people that you know, they're all quite like you, and it all feels great, then you might want to check yourself, because you might not be as right as you think you are. And just in the interest of being pretentious, I've got a Plato quote. So knowing about biases isn't enough, because you don't know your blind spots. And the thing about, there's a big overlap between cognitive and demographic diversity, and both are important to sort of recruit for and get into your team. But I guess one way to think about the difference is you could have 2 people who look different, but have grown up in similar-ish environments and have had the same education, they've gone to university, etc. And they might end up with quite similar worldviews and heuristics. So you need to think of ways to get around that and to think about cognitive diversity in different ways. So get people who have changed careers, who have been around, older people who have been around longer before the internet's been around, who have studied different things, who have worked in different countries. At Nomensa, we've got a really proud heritage of psychology, and it's a really good thing. But I think to improve diversity and improve performance, we need to consider people who are not necessarily psychologists, who might have a good understanding and an interest in it, but aren't necessarily trained in it. So maybe anthropologists, or I don't know, scientists or dentists. If they've transferred and they've got a keen interest in UX and they've done the work and have got some experience, I think they can add a huge amount. And then it's about ensuring their voices are heard, so they don't withhold their challenges. And through leadership and culture, giving them that space to challenge, and then for other people to feel like it's okay to be challenged. So cognitively diverse teams perform better because you're getting different mental models. And I've got this very simplistic demonstration of this. So if you've got a complex problem-solving space, this is what happens when you've got one person who is within that, and they're bringing all their experience and their understanding to it. And then if you bring several people that are all the same, you get some slight variation, but they're all still clustered around that part of the problem space. This is very simplistic. And then you get a broader range if you start to recruit people who are different, who think in different ways, and you get a better understanding of the whole space. And it's not just the problem space, it's also innovation. So recombinant innovation, which is this bringing together of different ideas from different domains to break down silos and to open new seams of possibility. That comes about through diversity as well. It's not just about solving problems. So the reason I've talked about this is because I think that, obviously, I think cognitive diversity is really important in teams. And I think it's interesting to understand the nuances around cognition as well when thinking about that. And finally, I've gone through some relatively heavy stuff, I feel. The first point, so just to recap, the first point is that routine decisions are often automatic. So asking why won't always give you the insight that you think it will, because they won't often know. Second is that research should be about observation, behaviour and data as much as possible. And other bits and pieces you need to take with a pinch of salt. Most actions happen below the level of the consciousness. It's not sufficient to act like you can just adopt or put a hat on and have another viewpoint. If you've grown up in a middle-class suburban environment, you can't pretend to know what it's like to think like someone who's grown up in an inner city, perhaps single-parent environment, left school at 14. So if that's important to the problem space, and even if it's not, you need people like that in the room to offer you a different viewpoint. And finally, I don't think this is pulling the carpet out from underneath the entire argument, but whilst a lot of philosophers believe there's no such thing as free will at all, most people agree that there is an element of free will. So the stuff around mental models, I think, is all valid, and automatic decisions. So most of our decisions are very automatic, but David Eagleman used this really nice analogy of like your consciousness being like the CEO. So they won't know every decision that's going on in the business, but they will be able to set vision. So they won't necessarily be able to intervene in whether you choose rock, paper, scissors, but you could go away and study strategies on, if they exist, on rock, paper, scissors, or you could go away and practice those things so that the next time you make a slightly different decision. So don't be too depressed. And I did say that if we had time, we would perhaps play some more rock, paper, scissors, but I think we should probably leave some time for some questions. So if you want to come and find me at any point and have a game, then I'd be delighted to. Thanks very much.